Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. Fascinating thing that's developing, and I think all of us underestimate the speed with which these things are evolving. But a semi-truck created by Bot Auto left Houston, Texas, and completed a 230-mile delivery to Hutchins, Texas, just south of Dallas, with no human inside. There was no driver, no backup to step in remotely if necessary. It's the first fully humanless, over-the-road commercial truckload in the United States. It traveled 230 miles north on I-45, one of the busiest freight corridors in the country. It navigated stoplights and side streets to reach its final destination. In 2025, Texas passed Senate Bill 2807, which created a formal authorization program for commercial autonomous vehicle operations administered by the Texas Department of Motor Vehicles. Talk about really being pioneering. I think Texas is showing the country something. Now, by contrast with the progress in Texas, the sense of excitement, the entrepreneurship, the low tax base, we turn to New York, where a major hedge fund, Citadel, is threatening to halt a $6 billion construction project over a proposal by socialist Mayor Mamdani. These guys are crazy. I mean, Trump was right in the State of the Union when he said, you people are just crazy. So Mamdani has this proposal that if you have an apartment or a home in New York, but you actually live, let's say, in Florida, which is the case, then they're going to tax your place in New York with a special high tax. And he announced it standing in front of the very expensive home of Ken Griffin, who is the leader of Citadel, which is a $51 billion personal value to Griffin. He's one of the top 35 richest people in the world. And he decided Mamdani's video was a personal attack on him. So literally, he's talking about canceling a project that would create a 62-story skyscraper, create 6,000 construction jobs, and more than 15,000 jobs once the building's completed. To soften the attack on Griffin, Mamdani, good socialist that he is, publicly thanked Griffin for funding a police memorial. You just watch. Between Mamdani, the socialist mayor of Seattle, and others, we're going to see so many nutty things. It's going to be unbelievable. Coming up, I'll be joined by Bret Baier, Fox News chief political anchor and author of the new book, The Case for America, an Argument on Behalf of Our Nation. I am really pleased to welcome back my guest and good friend, Bret Baier, author of 7 New York Times best-selling books, chief political anchor for Fox News, executive editor of Special Report with Bret Baier. Bret is here taking a brief break from his professional golf behavior to talk about his latest book, The Case for America, an Argument on Behalf of Our Nation. Thank you so much, Bret, for taking the time, because I know how amazingly busy you are.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So you wrote in your recent op-ed, ahead of the 250th, America has witnessed the triumph of resilience over despair, reflecting on the aftermath of violence following the Correspondence Dinner. What struck you the most about that moment, and why did you feel it captured something bigger about America?
Oh, listen, I think that we've been through a lot of bad moments in our country's history, and we always have a sense of bouncing back. That was just a traumatic moment. My wife was with me, and, she's under the table. I have been through a lot of things overseas and in Iraq and Afghanistan, and my first instinct was, is she okay? And then to report on what was happening. It was over in a matter of minutes, seconds, really. The Secret Service cracked down. But I just thought it was a microcosm of how we get through things as a country. And part of this book is about, making the case for why our country is resilient. If we look at our past, I tried to create it like making a case in front of a jury. And that's the structure of this book.
You wrote that the shooting at an event which was celebrating the First Amendment right of free speech felt like kind of a bitter setback. I mean, it was sort of uniquely, I think, symbolic in that sense. Was that your instant reaction, or did that come to you later?
Came to me later, but, I thought about it and thought, what a horrific thing, because here we were celebrating the First Amendment and it was kind of shattered. But then afterwards, and picking up and saying we're going to do it again, and the president's pushing to do another dinner. And the same week, also in that piece is the visit of King Charles and Queen Camilla and the speech he gives on Capitol Hill to a joint session in which the King of England, when we're getting ready to celebrate the Declaration of Independence anniversary at 250, breaking away from that country, he gives a speech essentially with the message, Americans should remember to be Americans, uniquely optimistic and forward-leaning, and, the identity of being American. And this is from the King of England. I just thought it was a unique moment juxtaposing those two things that happened in the same week.
I thought that he was remarkably effective, both in the words and in the delivery, and he is the only recent political figure to get both sides of the aisle to stand and applaud.
That's definitely true. Even President Trump joked that that's a rare feat. But I had the opportunity at the state dinner to talk briefly with him, and he said that was the message he was delivering. And he said, happy 250th. It was a really interesting moment.
I found him to be both very down-to-earth and very inquisitive, very interested in learning in a way that was not at all superficial. And I think it showed in his trip here. I thought he did a lot to strengthen the royalty and at the same time did a lot to strengthen our bond as a country with Great Britain.
Very much so. And I think the visit was really welcomed by President Trump and the administration in a time when the relation between the prime minister and the president had been a bit rocky, but clearly the king's visit helped.
You've written some very interesting books, and as you know, we've done several podcasts with you about some of them, and some of them I found your ability to take a particular moment in time and tell the story, and suddenly, even for somebody like myself who once upon a time was a historian, I keep learning from you. But this book is different for you. This is really kind of a message book. What motivated you to go to something like this? Because I think it's a little bit of a bold break from your norm and a really important book.
Well, it is a bold break from my norm because, I'm a news guy and I don't usually come with opinion pieces or verdicts on anything. I kind of lay it out. I report, you decide. And what I thought was that ahead of the 250th, the country has been in part on trial. And you can see that online. You can see that in social media, some of the things that are said about the country. And I thought it was important not just to look at the past. And you're right, writing about 6 of our greatest presidents was really a lot of ammunition for this book and specifics, but also talking to people today and present voices as they make the case for America. But as you look back at the 6 presidents I wrote about, you've got George Washington, the civic-minded Virginian who says yes every time the nation calls him to serve. Ulysses S. Grant, he's the lost soldier down on his luck, and he finds this talent and purpose in military leadership and then becomes one of the most consequential presidents during a challenging period. Teddy Roosevelt, he jumps off the page. His energy and drive is a new era of America's strength and vitality at the turn of the 20th century. Franklin Roosevelt, Teddy's cousin, who shepherds the nation through the Great Depression and World War II. Dwight Eisenhower, who leads, obviously, the Allied forces during World War II and then led the nation during really the most dangerous period of the Cold War. And Ronald Reagan, who brought the Soviet Union and the Cold War to its final days and really was the optimistic voice of morning in America. So individually and collectively, they represent the story of America. And I thought using that framework, kind of the girders of those 6 presidents, I could bounce forward and make a case like I'm presenting in front of a jury. And that's how I set out to do it.
You make a point that I frankly hadn't thought much about, that we instinctively, when we talk about America's birthday, go to the 4th of July, 1776, even though you could make an argument for things such as the battles of Lexington and Concord, or you could come later and talk about the ratification of the Constitution. I'm curious, from your standpoint, how you make the case and what your thoughts are about the central role of that signature in making us a country.
Yeah, I think that declaration was courageous. It was the leaders were risking their lives to do what they did ahead of the fighting that would later come and the success that came in the end. It was definitely not certain as they signed that declaration that it was going to work out the right way. In fact, along the way, there were many people who've said, this is stupid. Let's just go back to the kingdom and let's just throw down our arms and relent. Was it not for that moment and eventually George Washington leading what would be the Constitutional Convention, we wouldn't have a country. So in this book, I outlined basically 4 truths about the nation based on that moment. And that's America is choosing unity despite dissent, always. If you look through our history, dissent's baked in the cake, but we choose unity. America is a beacon of freedom. Eisenhower said freedom under the law is like the air we breathe, and freedom is a huge part of who we are. America has the gift of resilience, and you look at all that we've been through, even recent years and 9/11 and COVID, we always seem to bounce back, and that's uniquely American. And then it's the land of opportunity, and it still is. And the personal stories of people like Ken Langone and Condoleezza Rice and others really make that case that it's still a fact today.
For a very long period in the early 19th century, it was the Constitution, which was the centerpiece. And it's really Lincoln who resurrects and recenters on the Declaration, most notably in the Gettysburg Address. And Lincoln has this instinct that what makes us uniquely American is this document, and that you can come from anywhere on the planet if you want to be American. But it doesn't bind us by ethnic background or by religion or by geography. It binds us because there's this document that says that our rights come from our Creator, and that is such a direct threat to every tyrant in the last 250 years that it sort of makes America unique.
Yeah, 100%. And the founders were real people. They had disagreements. They had arguments. Before the Declaration's even written, there were heated debates in the Continental Congress, as you know. And the thought of being united, we are also free, and that dissent was part of who we are. And that Declaration kind of lays it out. They put their signatures on that declaration, and by then the Continental Army is already engaged in battles with the King's forces, and there was no going back. And the punishment for this at the time was hanging. And so they were in danger of doing that. That's why that moment seems to stand out.
Yeah, I think it's Franklin who said, we will all hang together or we shall hang separately.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is an amazing part of this process. I've recently begun to write about Jefferson talking about the Empire of Liberty and the degree to which the Founding Fathers actually thought that what they were doing was universal. They don't say Americans are endowed by their Creator. They say all men and women are endowed by their Creator. And I think in that sense, we are a much more radical nation in terms of normal human history than people realize.
Yeah. And the story of Jefferson and those early days, his writing, obviously, but then later in the 2 political parties emerge. And one is obviously John Adams and the Federalist Party, and the other is what was called the Democratic Republican Party by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And they become, Adams and Jefferson, are bitter rivals. It's Vice President Thomas Jefferson challenging the sitting President Adams, which if you think about it is pretty amazing. And then the campaign of 1800 is really ugly. I mean, it was vile. Insults all over the place. And this is 2 men who had founded the nation together and served as president and vice president. And so obviously that election is tied. It goes to Congress. There are 36 votes before Jefferson is declared the winner, and he becomes the 3rd president. And for the next 11 years, Adams and Jefferson did not speak at all. And they were destined to be enemies for life. And then out of the blue in 1812, Adams writes this friendly note to Jefferson, wishing him a happy new year. And slowly the 2 men begin corresponding, and they began to address their conflicts. And over 150 letters, they become close. And by 1820, Jefferson's writing Stuff like, I'm sure that I really know many, many, many things, none more surely than I love you with all my heart. They reached that point. They put the bitterness behind them because they had one message over time, and that was coming back together.
Well, I think people tend to forget that Jefferson, who at one level was a wonderful romantic idealist and great writer, but was also a remarkably ruthless politician. The whole term gerrymander comes from Eldridge Gerry as a Federalist in a desperate last effort to survive in Massachusetts, writing a map for Congress. Somebody says it looks like a salamander, and somebody else said, no, that's a gerrymander. I mean, the Jeffersonians, I always remind my Republican friends, this is the longest living political organization in the world. The Democrats have a remarkable capacity for survival. When we come back, more with Bret Baier on the state of America today, bipartisanship, division, and whether unity is still possible. You make the case that America isn't flawless, that we've often had tension and pressure. What's your sense of how we work our way out of the current environment?
Well, I think that America 250 is a unique opportunity to have that shared love of the country, no matter your political ideology. And part of that is looking back to the past and our history, and part of it is to acknowledge what's happening now. It's not a sanitized view. We're not looking through rose-colored glasses. There's a lot of problems with the country, but there are also a lot of lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who, in their heart, want to work together and get stuff done. I talked to Arthur Brooks, who I find fascinating, former head of AEI. Now he writes books about happiness. And he said that when he got people together in focus groups to talk about politics, really left and right, like far sides, he would say, we're going to talk about politics, and he could see people's back get up. And then he said, but first we're going to spend 10 minutes and we're going to talk about your families, your kids, what they do. And so then he had the focus group start there. And it was this shared love. They bond over parenting, struggles, and teenagers. And he said that this commonality, their shared love, is the way that we can get things moving again. So the case for America is a shared love for something that we have. And what can bring us together is what we most love about this country, what we most cherish about this country. And those things are laid out in this book, freedom being one of them, that you could pick up and leave where you are and start over in another city. And you can do that here.
We're an amazingly mobile society. You pick up something which, frankly, has frustrated me, and you use some analysis from GovTrack and others, that actually there's an amazing amount of bipartisan effort in the Congress, almost none of which can get covered because, by definition, it doesn't involve a fight, and therefore it sort of goes unnoticed. And can you tell me how many bipartisan bills are being passed under the shadow of these really nasty, aggressive partisan fights?
Yeah. Exponentially more bipartisan bills. I lay out the numbers in the book, but there are big bipartisan pieces of legislation. Most of them have sign-on from both parties. Very few are one-party dominated. There's some that have a few bipartisan co-authors. But for the most part, there is an effort on Capitol Hill that largely doesn't get covered, which is why on my show I started this segment, Common Ground, bringing Democrats and Republicans together to talk about what they're working on as opposed to what they're fighting about. And when I started it, my staff said to me, boss, this is going to be really hard to book. This is not going to be easy. And so I went up to Capitol Hill and I talked to all the press secretaries, left and right, Democrat, Republican. We got them in a big room, and I made the case saying this is the time that I'm not going to say we're not going to ask tough questions about the news of the day, but the purpose of the segment is to talk about what you all are working on together. And they all took it. And pretty soon it was a lot easier to book. And suddenly I had chairmen and ranking members. I had strange bedfellows who were diametrically opposed. And it was in the same mold as, Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy, who were tooth and nail on some issues, but became really good friends. You had the same experience when you were speaker, reaching across the aisle for a number of things. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan. And those moments, I think lifting them up helps bring a different level of leadership, and that could be the way forward.
I always try to remind people that the many things we did while I was speaker, welfare reform, the only 4 consecutive balanced budgets in a century, none of these would go into law without Bill Clinton's signature. So you had to have some sense of bipartisanship if you were serious about getting things done. Otherwise, it just wouldn't happen. And I think Congress right now really needs to almost go on vacation from the hardest issues for a little while, focus on getting in the habit of getting things done again. And I think they'd be much healthier and the country be, frankly, much more relaxed. Coming up, more with Bret Baier on the future of America, what comes next in the next 250 years, and what's at stake. You cover the daily news. I mean, you are, in some ways, almost the Walter Cronkite of our generation. But you also have thought a lot about the future. You talk about the next 250 years. What's the mood and tone you want to communicate about the next 250 years?
That there are scary things ahead, that there are uncertainties. With a whole new technological revolution, do we know what it's going to look like? No. We can have guesses about artificial intelligence. We can have thoughts about it. But what we can do is hearken back to our founding and those ideals and principles. And if we hold on to those, especially as we get ready to celebrate this 250th, that it provides a blueprint, a structure going forward. Listen, I have 2 kids, 2 boys, 18 and 15. It's tough to get them off the phone and online, and they absorb things differently. If I'm not posting on Instagram or YouTube or X, I'm not sure that I really factored in for that day. In their eyes, they're not watchers normally of Special Report every day. But I see in them this hunger to figure out how America is going to work. And one of the reasons I write these books is to really try to get to that younger generation. That's the ones that we're going to pass the baton to. And it's important that they have some structure about where we've been to maybe know where we're going to be.
When you take a brief moment off and sort of relax and let your mind just drift a little bit, what are the things that most worry you about the next 10, 15 years?
I think what most worries me is control, the fact that freedom is who we are. And if we lose some sense of freedom, there's a lot of questions about where that goes, where it ends up. And, you've seen positive things and negative things. I think there's a lot of optimism about artificial intelligence that we can solve a lot of problems in the world. I just think that there's a real battle about how we regulate it and still stay competitive with somebody like China, and that we don't get rolled over in that. And yet we don't let it go crazy and take control of us. So the battle of freedom and making sure that we still are free in every sense, I think is one of the things that worries me.
If you watch what's happening in Ukraine and in Iran, you have a North Korean, Chinese, Russian, Iranian coalition that explicitly are against liberty and that see us as the dominant threat or competitor for defining the future of the human race. I think your book is important because it reminds us that we really are extraordinary. This is an exceptional nation, and yet it's an exceptional nation which is open to the entire human race. Everybody ultimately can aspire to having their rights endowed by their Creator and having the right to pursue happiness. And I think in that sense, what you've written is a very important book coming out at exactly the right time to kind of refocus us.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, that was the purpose, and that's the premise. And I think freedom and what you talk about there, the ability that you and I have to get up and leave whatever we're doing and wherever we are and go someplace else we want in this country and start over and put a peg in the ground and say, Here's where we're going to be. We have no limits on what we can do if we abide by the law. And I think each one of these chapters dealing with different evidence to the case for America is important just to remember, to touch base and say, this is pretty good. We've got it pretty good.
Knowing how solid your work ethic is, I have to ask you, do you already have another book in mind?
I am actually torn between a couple of things, and I decided to really dig in and decide to research a little bit more. So I haven't pulled the trigger on an idea, but I love the process. As you know, I'm addicted to it. I think that discovering nuggets of history in the National Archives that put together like a quilt that tells a story that is readable now is really important. So it will be history at some point. I'm kind of narrowing down between a few choices. This book was different than any of the others I've written. The first time I wrote was about my son's battle with congenital heart disease, Special Heart, a journey of faith, hope, courage, and love. And that got me addicted to the process. And then from there, went into history and fell in love with that whole deal. So it'll be a little while, but I'm going to dig in and find the next great topic.
You have a fascinating rhythm between 5 days a week being immediate, and of course, if there's a big story that breaks, you're going to be right back in there. And then what's long-term and permanent? And you manage to balance both of them in a way that I think are probably mutually reinforcing.
Well, I love the process. Fortunately, I have a family that is okay with it. I write at night, and it's a balancing act, as you well know, but it's a labor of love. And when we get to this point where I'm talking about the book, it's really fun for me because I get to see reactions to it and how people absorb it. And hopefully it's for the betterment of the country overall.
I'm very curious, Bret, on our 250th birthday, how do you plan to spend the 4th of July?
Well, I will be working because it's a big, big day at Fox News, and we have a lot planned for the 250th. Ahead of it, I'll be out in North Dakota for the opening of the Teddy Roosevelt Library and Museum and doing a special out there and taking the show. And then on July 4th, I'll be in Washington and have all kinds of coverage through the day of America 250. But all of these events around this, I think, are going to be amazing to see, and we're excited to have people all over the country covering America 250.
Bret, I want to really thank you, given your busy schedule, for joining us today. Your new book, The Case for America, An Argument on Behalf of Our Nation, is really important, really well worth reading, and is perfectly timed for our 250th birthday.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate it.
Now, I'm pleased to introduce a new segment to Newt's World where I answer listeners' questions. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. This question comes from a member of my inner circle. Quote, Mr. Speaker, given the events that unfolded at the White House Correspondence Dinner, what do you think should be done about President Trump's plans to build a ballroom as part of the White House grounds? It seems to me that keeping the president safe should be our number one priority, and the ballroom needs to move forward with construction. Why are some people so against it? It's a great question. First of all, some people are so against it because they're against anything Trump does, period, anything, and therefore it must be a bad idea. Second, most of the people who are against it haven't looked at his real plan, which actually puts a very secure, safe facility in the basement underneath the ballroom and dramatically enhances the ability of the White House to operate in a dangerous environment. And then the ballroom itself, if you've ever been to the White House and you realize how small the East Room, which is where normally they do things, it's just not a very big room. And the president's thought, I think correctly, that we need a dramatically bigger room for a whole range of events. And I suspect it will revolutionize the ability of the president to be able to do these things. I look forward to hearing from you. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Thank you to my guest, Bret Baier. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at Gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.